Morning.
Now don't move.
Morning.
That's it.
Who's that man?
So what do we have today?
Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the potential cultural ramifications of disclosure and or first contact. And naturally, a lot of thinking has already been done in this direction. A lot of assumptions made and a lot of intelligent speculation ventured. But as I was thinking about it from a specifically philosophical point of view, uh, I started to imagine that this might affect something a little bit more like a Copernican turn. Not in the Kantian sense, but in the sense of Copernicus himself, or you might say Darwin. A situation where we find out we're peripheral in ways that we hadn't imagined, that we're contingent in ways that we hadn't imagined. And the funny thing about contact or disclosure would be that it would be another one of those Copernican events where we're more peripheral and more contingent, but at the same time, we're not peripheral and contingent relative to, you know, non-sentient forces that are playing out as causal processes in nature. Instead, we're finding out we're contingent with respect to another species that has conscious, sentient, intelligent agency. So, that's maybe that could be worth some discussion.
I tend to think that the effects of contact or disclosure, they are two separate things, broadly speaking, would depend entirely on the nature of the contact or the disclosure. In other words, what would actually happen. Because you can imagine it, in either case, happening 1,000 different ways. And each way playing itself out over the course of years, decades, centuries, would lead to very different things for mankind. It would lead to very different type of mankind in every case. So you're already dealing with a thought experiment with so many possibilities. It's hard to discuss it in a focused way. But I wonder if there's anything that could be said about essential effects on the human species, if there's anything that, any single outcome that would be assured. You say a Copernican turn, but I wonder what that would mean specifically, because it could mean a whole variety of things.
Well, if, for example, it turns out to be the case, as has often been alleged throughout the contact literature, that aliens altered the DNA of already evolving primates, that might account for some of the differences between human beings and other forms of terrestrial life. It might account for the fact that although modern Homo sapiens have existed for about 150 million years, all of a sudden 70 million years ago, we started doing things that we associate with cognition, like making art and doing burials and things like that, or stone tools. So why all of a sudden, if we were physiologically the same? That's the kind of question in, I guess you would call that paleoanthropology, I guess, or any number of other fields that we might look at in a totally new light if, for example, we saw that they revealed, or the government revealed, the less being more likely, as this detail would panic people and disrupt things. But let's say they reveal that that's what they did. So we'll start reappraising all these fields. But then cognitively, we're stuck with something more crazy, namely that it's kind of like a reverse Copernican turn. Because with Copernicus and Darwin, we were getting rid of God. Here, we might be back in touch with a demiurge, basically. You know, the Gnostic idea of a lesser God, which isn't the ultimate creator of reality, but a powerful creative force in its own right, which, in its flawed, sort of more contingent temporal imperfection, creates a equally flawed creation. So now these beings are, we don't know how old, much older than us. We know how there are already UFO religions, you know, Heaven's Gate, the Raelians. After we find out they're here and we have a sense of what they're capable of, we're going to have orientation of the whole a lot of the countercultural religious elements into deifying aliens in some way or another.
That, it seems to me, touches on maybe one of the more essential aspects. You see, if you mention a scenario in which, we somehow come to realize that extraterrestrials are responsible for, our origins or altering our DNA in some way, the question automatically arises as to how we would even find that out. Would that kind of detail automatically follow from contact or from disclosure? It seems at least as likely to me that with either contact or disclosure, you would start with an absolute lack of detail, which means that the type of effect that we're wondering about would belong to the category of what's more essential. If you want to use a term like human nature, given human nature, whatever that is, what can be said about contact or disclosure? Because once you get into the finer details, then you have, again, a field of possibilities that's just too broad. Maybe they altered our DNA, maybe they didn't. Maybe they've been living underground, maybe they're living on Mars. Maybe they're from some other parallel universe, maybe they're from the next star system. Maybe they're younger than we are. Maybe the nature of the organism, for whatever reason that they represent, maybe they shot from consciousness to interstellar travel in a much shorter period than we did. Maybe they're smarter than we are. Well, these are all details. But at that kind of ground zero of contact or disclosure, without going into detail, I wonder if anything can be said about human beings, how they would be changed, how they would react. In terms of the Copernican turn, or you mentioned Darwin, these events took place at the level of human knowledge, and there were cultural wars that followed that lasted decades, even centuries, as these conclusions sort of disseminated. And people resisted, people misunderstood them, people enthusiastically adopted the conclusions while misunderstanding them. Even today, among the general public, you might find a willingness to believe in evolution, in the validity of the theory of evolution, and yet find massive misunderstandings about it. But all of that, it seems to me, is a separate category. If you had contact of some kind, or if you had disclosure of some kind, these would be, to some extent, encounters with externalities. These wouldn't be necessarily some guy, some astronomer, or some natural scientist offering a scientific theory with all sorts of cultural ramifications. This would be more like a natural event, whether they actually showed up in an undeniable way in the case of contact, or whether there was some sort of governmental disclosure, quote unquote. How would people react in the absence of detail, in the absence of knowledge? And what would that show about mankind?
Well, I think one thing that's guaranteed are the religious effects. Uh, I've seen surveys, and I can't quote the numbers specifically, but I've seen surveys that suggest that most religious believers say that their faith, a majority of them, say their faith wouldn't be interrupted or fundamentally overturned by the discovery of extraterrestrial life. However, I mean, it's in the very nature of religious belief to mutate perpetually, just like genetics. And if you look at the profusion of sects and like the different interpretations of scriptures and the variations of practices that propagate from one century to another, it is a very fluid medium that's perpetually transforming. And when things are discovered, they start to get appropriated. When new ideas are encountered, either there's antagonism or synthesis, or usually both happening on different levels. Maybe one becomes an orthodoxy, or maybe another remains like this weird fringe heterodox thing. But I mean, all this is very familiar historical detail. But look at the past century. We don't have contact. We don't have disclosure, but we do have the history of sightings. We have the theater in the sky of UFOs that have been sighted and recorded and tracked on radar. We have the abduction phenomena. We have all of these things which get out into the culture. And so what's the effect? Like I mentioned before, there are already UFO cults and even a separate category of UFO religions. Because, you know, some of these things are not cults in the specific sense that a cult is, I think, defined as cutting itself off from society. But in the UK, there's this church where people are middle class people. They have regular jobs. They're integrated into society. But nevertheless, they believe that Jesus came to Earth in a spaceship from Venus. Okay. Not to mention, like surrounding Whitley Strieber, we have this sense of the visitors as hermetic sort of occult initiators into some kind of mystery tradition. The Strieber picture of them is that, while he says we don't know their whole agenda and they may have multiple agendas, he describes in his own experience this initiatory aspect of it, where they're teaching you to meditate and they're revealing things about the nature of reality, and they're trying to lead to the evolution of your consciousness, right? So you'll see more of that kind of thing. So big point being that the religious dimensions of this, I think, are assured.
Yeah, I think by and large, among segments of even Western populations, but certainly worldwide, you'd have this flourishing of the religious impulse. You know, I only encountered this term, prayer as petition, sometime within the past couple of years. But it's a very eye-opening term because basically, at least in the sort of Western Christian model, prayer is a form of petitioning. You're petitioning an all-powerful being to intercede on your behalf, to solve some problem or to fix some situation. And if you had beings that were presumed more powerful show up in the flesh, I think it'd be automatic for large numbers of people just because of the precariousness of human life, to focus their desperation onto these more powerful beings. Well, if they can travel here from the stars, maybe they can cure cancer. Can they cure my sick loved one? Can they cure me? Can they do this? Can they do that? If they can, and I can't help but believe they can, why don't they? Why aren't they? Why aren't they doing more? Why aren't they giving us free energy? Why aren't they doing this? So you'd have a sort of rebirth, in a sense, of the whole set of energies having to do with hope and frustration and fixation that you once had more strongly collected together in religion. But it's hard to say. I'm not sure that that would be universal. I do agree, as far as the conventional religions go, that they would probably be unharmed, because in today's world, religious belief is so compartmentalized that it's petrified. If you observe a Christian church service today, like in the Church of England or in the Catholic Church, it's devolved so far into empty ritualism without any ritual, in a way, that it's basically habit. And when you have articles of faith that the true believers say they believe in, it's hard even to identify belief, really. What you find instead is a reluctance to go otherwise, to believe otherwise, to say they believe otherwise. And there's such a remoteness when you look at, to use those examples again, the Church of England or the Catholic Church, there's such a remoteness from the original cultural milieu in which these, well, in particular Catholicism, in which that developed, the whole world of antiquity, that it's meaningless. It's practically algebraic. The things that they're saying and the things that they're doing, they don't even make sense at the level of association. I suppose they make sense at the level of tradition. If you're raised in a particular church and you're always doing the same thing, you're going up and you're taking communion, and you've done it for years, and you've observed your family members doing it for years, and as a matter of fact, that your parents, your grandparents, and previous generations did it, then in that sense there's a basis for it. But it's very hard to find any other basis for it. Even when you have new believers today, well, let's say true believers today, they are not coming out of a place that's the same as the one from which these religions developed. I mean, this is something of the impulse behind Protestantism to begin with, and then the reason why you have so many offshoots and so on, because they had the religious impulse, but they also had a cultural milieu which was different entirely from the one in which the established church arose and was its natural setting. So in any event, I think the religious believers, yes, the traditional religious believers, they will not be harmed because they're already so compromised and they already believe so little effectively in what they say they believe in that they're practically immune to any kind of environmental change. On the other hand, I think there's something unique happening in Western countries today with the advent of high science, high technology, and so on, that it's changing the human being. Maybe it's just a temporary change, but it's a change enough You know, the whole transhumanism thing, and you can associate with that the whole transgender thing. This sort of high-tech virtual world that people in urban centers are living in today in the Western world is producing, at an individual level, I think, people that are very different from those in the past by and large. And these people, I think, would be similarly immune to any kind of dramatic upheaval in themselves. In a way, you could see all of these changes that are happening in contemporary culture towards scientism, with the internet, instantaneous communication, with traditional biological sexes being the binary system being put aside in favor of 66 genders, courtesy of surgical and chemical interventions and so on and so forth. That's almost a movement toward the alien. So those people, I think, would be immune. But other groups who don't participate in either of the two mentioned, among them, I think you could see that kind of dramatic, desperate reawakening of the religious impulse. And you could see that impulse directed toward intelligent, conscious beings that either make contact with us in an overt way or we're told exist courtesy of some sort of disclosure scenario.
Sure. And I mean, the sheer incomprehension that we're likely to manifest with response to these beings, I think, is going to color a lot of it. And when I say that it'll be incomprehensible, I have in mind specifically the possibility that they're substantially older than us. There's really no realistic cap on what the gulf between the civilizations might be. As you mentioned, they might be of comparable age or even younger, but through some accident of biology or technological development, they happen to become interstellar much sooner than we would presume is natural to the life cycle of a species. But if they are substantially older, consider this. Let's say they're 1 billion years older than us. Well, 1 billion years ago, on Earth, there was just, I guess, complex multicellular life, I think, just beginning to emerge. I think for the first 1 billion years, it was like unicellular life, but that's besides the point. There are just basically what would look to us unlearned people who don't know about microbiology, like bacteria, let's just say. And that's the gulf of 1 billion years. How comprehensible are we to the denizens of this planet 1 billion years ago? We couldn't even be conceptualized as gods because there weren't even concepts. So if they're similarly older than us, then they are further away from the cognitive capacities of an ordinary human being than Yahweh was supposed to be. Because Yahweh had human preoccupations. Yahweh cared how you sacrificed your animals and how you harvested your food and what days you did what. But these beings would be further away from us than the traditional Western God in such a situation.
Well, you can extend that and say, you know, so if the analogy holds, you can extend it just slightly further and suppose that, okay, if they are that incomprehensible to us, or some group is, you know, not to say that all other conscious, intelligent species in the universe are the same, but supposing some group exists and it is that far ahead of us that we can't even conceive of them. In that case, they could already be here. They could have been here for the longest time. And similarly, there might never be any kind of contact as we conceive it. There might likewise never be any kind of disclosure event. If they're that far outside of our understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen suggestions to the effect that part of the reason for the secrecy might be because some of the interests involved determined that there is what appears to be a non-material reality behind some of these phenomena, such that the beings in question aren't actually physical, even though they have quasi-physical like means of conveyance that they travel in. I just heard Grant Cameron talking about this recently as I was following up on some threads in my effort to understand what was going on with the sort of micro disclosure events that transpired last year. And if it's true that, I mean, one way or another, whether or not we have some kind of reality breaking ontological crisis, or whether or not they're just interstellar, it's going to potentially create a lot of momentum in science, because we're then going to have to account for, okay, well, as far as we know, FTL is very unlikely. And in order to do it, let's say you built a warp drive, you'd need access to like negative mass, and you'd have to be able to do this, that, or the other thing, or maybe that's not how they do it at all. And so it would start to define the direction in which we think, and you know, that'll bleed over into the humanities too, because humanism is based largely on the idea that we're the most precious kind of thing there is, and we're the most advanced kind of thing there is. So if humanism is the default cultural paradigm of the humanities, that's potentially going to undergo a little bit of a crisis as well.
Well, there would certainly be cultural changes, and predicting those changes, I think, is effectively impossible, because we cannot, in a meaningful way, predict the cultural changes that happen to us when we're just talking about ourselves. If you were someone in 1910, you wouldn't be able to have any kind of picture of what life is like today, just like we can't really come up with any kind of credible picture of what life will be like in 100 years. And this is not just some, meaningless touting of scientific progress. I'm not saying, oh, science is so great, that remakes the world. No, I'm just saying that the human future and the forms that culture takes, it's so dynamic and so fluid that you can't really map it out in a linear way. But if you had something like contact, or to a lesser extent disclosure, but let's say more like contact, I can see it resembling more what we see with human beings when faced with natural disasters or with war. There are situations that happen to populations where culture is sort of suspended. You see it with big-time natural disasters, and you also see it with war, where people are faced with situations of such intensity that they're thrown back upon themselves, and it's anything goes. I could see something similar in a contact scenario or a possible disclosure scenario in which human beings are faced with enough of a calamity that they're thrown back on themselves in a way that goes beyond mere cultural transformation, which makes it even harder to predict, but it's in a way easier to imagine, you couldn't predict the precise situation or the forms or the history that would unfold, but it is easy to imagine people in situations of maximum desperateness, maximum confusion, because it happens again and again throughout history, it happens all the time. So there are scenarios you can imagine in which something like that would occur. Human beings are thrown back on themselves. That would be a dramatic thing. I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm not necessarily talking about something apocalyptic, which would be another way of trying to frame it as a religious event. I'm not saying that. But, I mean, if you are in New Orleans after Katrina, or you are in Europe in the middle of World War I, where basically culture is suspended, all bets are off, you see people reacting in the only way they can, and often the results are ugly, unfortunately.
Now then, to make this somewhat easier,
Well, one thing that I wanted to add in regards to contact and disclosure and the possible effects and what form they all would take is something that's a wild card, and that is the overused term consciousness. I listen regularly to these podcasts where people call in and they tell their crazy experiences. And there are perhaps more of these podcasts than you might think. These days, you can find easily a half dozen where every episode is just 5 or 6 callers, people who will call in or leave messages where they describe their UFO experiences, their Bigfoot experiences, their, auntie's experience with ghosts. And they call in and they don't use their full name, and they're obviously not going to be paid any money. They tell their story. Often they're quite interesting, not always. But you hear a real variety of accounts, and you also, I think these podcasts actually serve, without realizing it, a very valuable function, because they amount to a kind of oral history that is in progress of the experiences that people have with these things that maybe wasn't possible before. But at any rate, in just the past week or two, I've heard 2 separate accounts involving UFOs. And these are simply sightings accounts, lights in the sky, but in each case, in one story, it's a man saying he's looking up and he sees one thing, and in the different show, different story, it's a woman, she sees something, she looks up. And in either case, the person reports along the way that he or she, not in the same words, but has some sort of mental contact with it. In one case, a man might say that he had the distinct feeling that it was playing with him. It was aware that he was looking at it. And something similar in the other case with a woman who's looking out the window of her house and she sees maybe a totally different light or object in the sky. But then she says that when she sees it, she becomes aware or convinced that it or its occupants are aware of her. Now, these aren't 2 cases in isolation. You can hear this sort of thing all the time. Not always. Sometimes people will just report what they have seen in terms of its visual characteristics and never say something like, well, I just felt sure, I knew that it was looking at me, or it knew I was looking at it. Or they'll go further and they'll say, I knew that it was playing games with me, and not simply because of its behavior, but because of some sort of almost like personal contact that's very hard to account for. And you hear of plenty of other cases as well where somebody might say, I saw this thing and somehow just became aware that it was surprised that I had seen it, or it was upset, or, whatever, that I had seen it. Now, what does any of this mean? It seems to me that these sightings, the fact that there are enough of them that involve something that you can call consciousness provisionally, these sightings are at one end of a spectrum. And if you go all the way up through the spectrum, certainly among contact accounts and abduction accounts and so on, one of the almost universal features is something like telepathic contact. Now, I would say that even though it's difficult to do, we have to somehow, if we can, put aside all of the metaphysical and spiritualist perspectives that people have tried to develop when it comes to consciousness. And likewise, we should try to put aside, the mechanistic ones based on current science and so on and so forth. And that includes the parapsychological ones, where they're still trying to find some sort of causal mechanistic system that will account for how things like telepathy and so on are possible. Why do I say that? Well, I think that consciousness in this context is something that is operative at the level of everyday life on a day-to-day basis in ways that we actually experience and participate in, but also cannot conceptualize and are in a way not aware of. It's a kind of walking blind spot. I don't think at this point that consciousness is anything as esoteric as people have made out, whether they're using esoteric, metaphysical, spiritualist descriptions, or whether they're trying to come up with quantum theoretical, esoteric, scientific descriptions. I think there's a whole area of daily phenomenology, if you want to call it that, of consciousness, where we're actually practically split-brained because we are involved in its use, but at the same time are not aware of it and seem to be unable to be aware of it. What kind of examples? Well, before getting to the areas where we're not aware of it, there are a couple that are now well known that show how you are aware of it, like the feeling of being watched. This was done up a lot recently, I think, by Rupert Sheldrake, the morphogenetic fields guy, if I'm not mistaken. That's an example that people can relate to, but it's one that they can conceptualize because the experience of being, let's say, under threat is a base level enough experience when it comes to human experience in general that I don't think it's hard for people to locate it in their reflective space, let's say. You know, if you come into your apartment after you've been out all evening, it's late at night, you walk inside, and all of a sudden you have an eerie feeling, maybe that you're being watched, and then 5 seconds later, some murderer leaps out of the closet. Well, you can associate that feeling of perhaps being looked at with the general, situation of being threatened, which is common enough to human life and the life in general that we don't have any trouble thinking about it. Maybe if not in the most specific or complex terms, we're able to at least recognize it. But I think once you begin to move out of that area, there are all sorts of situations in day-to-day life where actual consciousness in this sort of sense occurs, and yet we cannot be aware of it. We can't reflect upon it yet for some strange reason. I had something happen a year or two back where, without going into a lot of detail about it, I got an email from my older brother out of the blue. And it wasn't something that was so out of the ordinary because, we're in occasional email contact, every couple of weeks or every couple of months. But I got an email out of the blue. He said he wanted to talk to me, and that was basically the content of the email. And I instantly knew what it was he wanted to talk about, and with specificity. And it was about something that had happened a long time ago, and there would be no recent reason to think that the topic was going to come up. There had been no subtle indications or anything like that. Just something where it, bang, you knew. You simply knew. Now, I think consciousness, when we put aside all the metaphysical crap and then we put aside all the scientific crap, what are we talking about? I think one way to start to see it is to see it as simply knowing something with some level of specificity, powerful knowledge. And that's what you have in these accounts of these people who look up, seeing lights in the sky, and they simply know that it's looking at them. Or they simply know all of a sudden that it's surprised that it's being seen. This sort of thing. Now, I'll just add one or two other things. Identical twins. This has been talked about often enough, but there are cases of identical twins separated at birth, removed to different parts of the country or even around the world. What ends up happening, both of them become firemen, and both of them own red trucks, and both of them are married to a woman whose first name begins with the letter K or something like that. Now, I think it's possible that the genetic affinity between two identical twins is strong enough that somehow, even if you don't say that there's a communication between consciousnesses, because that in itself is an attempt to look for some sort of mechanistic explanation, talking about it in terms of communication, information being moved from point A to point B, it's not at all clear that that's what's involved. It could be, for example, that both people share the same consciousness in some weird way. But anyway, suppose that genetic affinity, the more genetically similar two individuals are, the more likely this sort of thing happens. Suppose that's why mothers will suddenly get a sense that a child has died from across the country, or people within the same immediate family not all of them, but some of them here and there, suddenly have this knowledge about somebody in the family. It could be that there's a physical basis for this knowing, and that when we're talking only about human beings, because of the level to which it's developed, we see it most pronounced when people are most genetically similar, and perhaps less pronounced as they become genetically dissimilar. You look at these reincarnation cases, this famous one about the kid, this Leininger kid, who, while he's a toddler, has all these terrible nightmares about being in a plane on fire. And then he gives all this detail about his previous life. They finally decide that he's talking about a previous life, and then they track down who the guy was. And sure enough, it was a guy with the same name, also named James, I think, who was shot down, blah, blah, blah. And when you look at the childhood photos, apparently of the two of them, they look almost identical. And you got these other reincarnation cases where somebody who, let's say, gets his hands chopped off in a previous life, supposedly, where we're told, now is reincarnated and he's born with deformities of the hands. Or somebody gets shot in the head, and then, child's born, the child has a massive birthmark on the side of the head, and they come out with these memories of being shot. Well, maybe we're not dealing with a genetic similarity necessarily, but something like a physical similarity, which obviously is similar, because obviously genetic similarity is physical similarity, but not all physical similarity is genetic. So maybe the two overlap in some way that we don't understand. In these cases of reincarnation, for example, or someone knowing, well, let's say someone sees a ghost. Someone sees a ghost of Uncle Bob one night in a dream, and the next morning gets a phone call that Uncle Bob died in the middle of the night. These could simply be sensory modalities of the same knowing. The knowing could be the primary fact, and the dressing of it, like the dream or whatever, could be almost a hallucination that the mind produces in order to account for the knowing. The same could go for reincarnation in a certain sense. It's not necessarily that some soul that inhabits one body goes, into the ether, then comes back into another body. It could be somehow that the physical situation in an individual, especially a young one, in some way we don't understand, reassembles the information, if you want to call it information, of a previous life, memories and so on. Even that sounds too mechanistic to me, because, again, consciousness may not be something that is separate, rooted in the brain, and then, is a matter of being translated by information, blah, blah, blah. But now the more interesting thought, you get all of these accounts of the so-called grays all being identical, physically identical. Now, given that you have these situations where identical twins among the human population have these totally improbable affinities and can know things, maybe they don't know about each other, but somehow their experience in the world, their knowledge of the world is shaped a certain way. What would happen if you bred a population of identical twins? As a thought experiment, obviously they're no longer twins because you've got 1 billion of them, but they're all genetically identical. What would happen if you started observing the population, these same affinities, and maybe even something that you might call telepathic contact among them as a result? What would happen if you knew that somehow you had access to knowledge about how this occurs. Let's say whatever is going on with two identical twin humans who have these special relationships that can't be explained. What if you knew a bit more about that? Suppose you took it upon yourself as a population. You said, well, listen, we're going to start genetically engineering ourselves to become more genetically similar to the point of being identical. Maybe we'll improve ourselves along the way and select for all sorts of traits that we think will help us in this environment or in space travel. What if the telepathy, the knowing of each other's minds, the disappearance of the need to use language, what if all that is simply an effect of breeding a population or genetically engineering a population to the point of being identical? Well, it's an interesting speculation, but to bring it all the way back around to contact and so on, suppose that, as seems to be the case, at least a lot of the time, whoever is out there, their basic mode of being in their world is this sort of consciousness that we give these wonderful terms like telepathy and so on. What if, for whatever physical reasons, they are possessed more constantly by a more powerful sense of knowing, in the same way that we open our eyes and we're possessed of the sense of sight, or if our ears aren't plugged, we are simply hearing all day long. So, consciousness in this other way is a sense, and it's always on for them. Human beings have it too, but it's not developed well enough so that it's all the time or as distinct. Well, what would happen in a contact scenario if this consciousness-bearing population showed up? What would be the effect on human beings, their consciousness? Again, not in terms of progress, not in terms of spirituality, which are all these sort of veiled moral terms. But if you started to have routine contact with some other population that was in this mode where they're using the consciousness in this more narrow sense all of the time, could it be possible that you might start to provoke that among the human population? And then what would happen if some segment of the population were able to go that way, but then some other segment wasn't? Maybe they didn't have the genes for it, or whatever the story is. They simply can't do it. It could be that contact of that sort could produce negative effects in the human population automatically for that reason. It's like if you, you go to a primary school, say you're a painter. This is a fatuous example, but you go to a primary school, there's a class of little kids, and you're a painter, and some of the kids take to painting the first time they've ever done it very easily, and they congregate around you, and some of the kids just cannot grasp it or something like that. Maybe painting is a bad example. Let's say maybe it's math or something else, but I think you get the idea. You could induce segregation in the population and have all sorts of disastrous effects without trying to do it. And this is a perfectly legitimate reason for there not to be contact, at least not at the moment. Not for like obscure spiritual reasons, and not for esoteric quantum mechanical, their minds constitute reality in some way that, is mortally and ontologically threatening to us. It could be something as severe but less dramatic, and it could account for a number of things.
Well, I could see that. Um, you've got me thinking about Leibniz now, in two ways specifically. One is the pre established harmony, and another is the identity of indiscernibles. Now, Leibniz, of course, uh, like a lot of other people in his generation, was trying to respond to the apparent duality between mind and matter that got set up in the Cartesian project. It was awfully difficult to reconcile how mind, as it was conceived in a Cartesian context, as an unextended and immaterial thing, could interact with an extended and material thing. Now, Leibniz's solution was just to say, they don't actually interact, and what's actually taking place is that in the beginning of time, God and his omnipotence and his omniscience was able to just orchestrate the material and the mental in such a way that they'd always be in sync. And, I don't mean to suggest anything like that here, but at least not in those sort of theological terms. But maybe there's a naturalist way that something similar could be the case and be at work in the mind-body problem. Because you talk about these twins who might have increased capacity for our paranormal things, or what we would usually call paranormal things, to happen, and that's because of they deviate less from the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, which is basically the idea that if two things have the same properties, they are actually the same thing. And this has some weird applications in science. Like, for example, there is this theory of the one electron universe. They always say that if you take any two examples of a fundamental particle, like an electron, they're all the same. They just differ in their spin and their velocity and other, I guess you could use the word extrinsic properties. They're accidental relations. Uh, I don't usually I don't want to promote the intrinsic extrinsic distinction being applied in exactly that way, but it's easy to talk about it that way for our present purpose. But it's possible to think that there's only one electron in the universe. And it's actually possible to say that, to have a coherent picture of the world that is fully in keeping with the rest of the theoretical dictates of accepted science, in which all of these electrons are actually one thing. And that's just, in a way, the identity of indiscernibles being allowed to run its course. So here we're talking about the idea that if this population of these beings, they're actually fully identical in a robust genetic sense, and even more so, unlike a pair of identical twins, because identical twins, despite their genetic similarity, will start to diverge because their brains are being imprinted by, the extremely complex array of cultural and psychological experiences that any ordinary human being has in the course of their moving through the world. If the Greys are genetically self-similar, and if they're also much more psychologically self-similar, because, look, if the abduction phenomena really does give us a clear picture into what it's like to be around them, then they're curiously lacking in manifestations of what we would think of as culture. There's not a lot of aesthetic objects. There's not a lot of use of color or texture that evidences the forms and traditions of people interacting over time and modifying what they deem as beautiful or desirable. Everything is so much more minimalistic that they appear to be post-cultural. And to be post-cultural is, in a way, to be post-individual, you know, because culture arises from the conflict between different values and different senses of what is good, what's real, and what's aesthetically beautiful. So if we come into contact with people like that, it could, like you're saying, it could evoke more of the latent psychic capacities in ourselves. And, you know, I don't know. I don't think that would be bad. I mean, that is, if it led to a conflict between people who could do that and people who couldn't. It would probably be distributed pretty randomly, even if it had a one-to-one relationship with some underlying genetic substrate that allows you to do it more or less. Because I think that would probably be distributed pretty randomly through the population, probably across class lines, across you know, other demarcations in society. So it could give rise to some weird tension, but weird tension is what history is made of. And the outcome could be pretty alien. But I don't know that, well, first of all, I don't know that we have a choice, because sooner or later, the wall is going to come down around this for some reason or another. And even if they don't disclose, even if disclosure doesn't lead to contact, in a post-disclosure world, people are going to appraise what we know about the close encounter experience much more often. And intelligent people might look at it much more closely. So we could get some of the cultural transformation. We would think of it as tending to contact just from disclosure, because in the sense that we have a window into how this other society operates, because people are paying more attention to the scraps of information we have.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Leibniz. I was formulating in the past few days my final philosophical position. I had to go back and revisit Descartes a little bit. And my final position was that thought has extension. You know, in the classic accounting for Descartes' philosophy, they'll say that, you know, what distinguishes matter is that it has extension. And then they try to repeat it another way, which is to say that it takes up space. And by contrast, thought does not. And that, you know, there's the division between the two. And it's seemed to me for the longest time that, without being able to put it in Cartesian terms, that really thought does have extension. Thought has a spatiality and a temporality. If you tell a joke, you know, the joke is vectoring toward the punchline. The famous saying, paraphrased by Oscar Wilde, I can resist anything but temptation. If you've never heard it before, you get to I can resist anything, and it has one complete meaning. Except temptation, now retroactively, a totally different meaning's been conferred upon it. You look at the categorical syllogism. You have to take the premises in sequence and relate them to each other temporally for it to be in any way meaningful. Even at a more primary level, I've said for a long time that negation, being able to say P and not P, assumes symmetry. In other words, it's based on a geometrical intuition. Anyway, that can all be put aside. When you bring up people like Descartes and Leibniz and others from the period, and it continues up to today, all of the critiques of dualism and the problems wrestling with it, so on, the same weaknesses of dualism, if you look at it a certain way, are present in all of these models that attempt to explain things in causal terms today. So, the idea that there's telepathy, which means that some unit of information is somehow exchanged from point A to point B, and what's the mode of conveyance, and what form does the information exist in before it moves, and while it's moving, and then after it takes root. All of these attempts to explain things in causal terms assume space and time. It seems to me that that's really what we're getting at when we're talking about causality. There's a spatial difference. There's a temporal difference. Now, however, in a lot of these experiences that people relate about looking up at the sky and seeing the thing, they simply know some very specific thing all of a sudden. And my impression from all these different accounts is that it's not as if there's some information that gets exchanged. There's no, radio transmission from one brain to another. And I'm even inclined to think that attempts to explain this sort of thing in terms of superposition and so on are another species, another variety of the same thing, and may ultimately be doomed to fail. The other side to this, though, is that the cognitive blind spot that we have to these experiences of the emergence of consciousness every day, I think are down to the fact that they are, for us, to some great extent, still inaccessible to thought. They're inaccessible by thought. We can't think it because thought, as we've developed it, the way it exists today, is basically causal. When we give accounts of ourselves, when we give accounts of our motivations, for example, the motivation always precedes the deed. So A leads to B. We try to convince someone else of something, even if we're not even being truthful. We're trying to bring about a change in their behavior. We're trying to get them to act some way we want them to act. That's trying to, a cause trying to produce an effect. And when it comes to introspection, and when it comes to reflection, it's not necessarily so, but certainly in our historical moment, and perhaps always, this is like it's an instrument of causal explanation. And yet, nevertheless, these experiences of consciousness occur. I think they occur all the time. I think people often will look at somebody and simply know something. And that these instances of knowledge can be fully developed. They're very narrow, but they can be fully developed within their limits, and they can be accurate. Now, where do you draw the line between things like subconscious influences and acquired prejudices and associations and all of that? And these are, again, causal factors. And this knowing, well, I can't say. And trying to do so, of course, is itself a kind of causality-related enterprise. It needs to be done, but nevertheless. But I mean, to use an analogy, I mean, imagine that there's some group, there's like a tribe. This is to get back to another point that you made. Assume you've got some small clan of people, and they're human beings, and they've got legs, and everything's fine, but no one has ever run before. And then one day, some people show up from the outside world, and they run in front of them. you may find that some number of the clan, maybe certainly among the younger people to be sure, see this behavior and instinctively go toward it and start to recreate it, and they can run. And there are others who, even though physically they ought to be able to, they just can't do it. They can't make the leap. They can't cross over for whatever reason. What happens is not the apocalypse. So when I'm talking about possible effects of contact when you're looking at consciousness in this way, I'm not talking about the end of the world or anything necessarily like that, but disruption, significant disruption. And if they, whoever they are, let's say, don't want to cause that particular kind of disruption, that could account for the very furtive nature of the whole thing.
You know, I've been doing a lot of thinking about causality. I was rereading Nagarjuna's treatise on the tenets of his middle way philosophy, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And right at the beginning, he starts attacking the idea of causality. Now, this is a little funny because, from a certain point of view, Buddhism is based on causality. It presupposes that causality is the most fundamental thing, because if you read all these sutras about dependent origination, about it's just a very central concept. But Nagarjuna obviously is historically later, and obviously he's bringing about the advent of the Mahayana, which is a distinct movement. But when people think about Buddhism, I mean, they think about it as more or less cohering over time. So I think that Nagarjuna is right. And let me say a little bit about this. He says that, well, I'm not going to try to replicate his argument, but what he says boils down to the fact that you can't actually ever observe a cause. If you take a look at your hand, and you say, can you see the difference between your fingers? And you would say, yes, certainly. But then if you ask the same person, well, do you see difference itself? Well, it becomes clear that difference isn't actually a property of the world. It isn't actually there to be observed. It's a word we use to organize experience. And I think what Nagarjuna's argument boils down to, he's not talking about observation, but what it boils down to is that causality exists in the same sense that difference exists. It's a concept that's being used to organize a certain array of sensations. And of course, this is really comfortable with Hume. It fits in with Hume in the sense that he says that no matter how many times I light a match and it starts a fire, I don't have a necessary reason for expecting that it'll happen again, and for that, because of that, a lot of things that people usually presume are aspects of the world are shown to be suppositions about the world. Now, I think that if anything happens to undermine traditional notions of causality, it's going to start to undermine not just esoteric things like the philosophy of science, but probably culture more generally. Because I think that you could say that the belief in causality as an intrinsically real force, as a kind of power, or as a something that's essential to the nature of reality, kind of is the glue around which a lot of culture is based. People believe in it in a really, really deep way. I was watching this lecture recently by this guy, this professor called Stephen Mumford. And basically, he's trying to cast himself in his own mind as a new Descartes. Because he wanted to retreat from the world for a couple of days. He went way, way up north in Scandinavia or something and was staying in a cabin by a fjord. And he was trying to come to the very foundation of what he could know, just like Descartes. And he talks about subsisting off of a block of cheese and just sitting there and listening to the whales while he tries to interrogate reality and see what he can walk away with. It's an interesting lecture, and he winds up thinking that causality is real and causality is God. That's the title that they give the lecture on YouTube. Because he says, like, ultimately, God himself is subservient to causality. Because if God's going to do something and say, let there be light, and it occurs, then the reality of causality as inclusive universal logically precedes God. So causality is, he says something to the effect of, we should pray to causality, and we should give thanks for causality. Obviously, this guy, like Descartes himself, has got a real theological bent. So causality is central to us, and to the point where people can say things like that. Whereas if two events can occur at the same time, like these psychic things, and there's not a mechanical explanation. And even given a lot of what we observe in quantum mechanics, where you've got apparent retrocausality and you've got non-locality, and causality doesn't seem like it is an abstract universal that subsists in the universe and is prior to language. It seems more like a way of looking at reality, and it's equally legitimate to look at reality in terms of its logical relations. Let's say, for example, I guess that just comes back to maybe there's two fundamental ways to organize experience. Like they say, subspecie aeternitatis, or intempore, right? So either under the aspect of eternity or in time. If you're going to look at things in time, you're going to think of it in terms of causality. But that's a perspective that's contingent on us being these particular kinds of biological beings. Maybe the real structure of reality, if we could be so daring, is it's more convenient not to talk in causal terms, but to talk in relational terms.
Well, trying to refute the concept of causality at the level of thought, it's certainly been done, and it's been done well in a lot of cases, but it still is different, it seems to me, than what would effectively be a refutation of it should a bunch of otherworldly beings show up who are calling forth out of us all the time, or at least often enough that it significantly shapes our experience, this kind of knowing. They're at all different levels in philosophy and elsewhere. They have problematized the concept of causality. They've made it more complex. You've got multiple types of causality. But all this still occurs at the level of thought. even those who would say, for example, well, causality doesn't exist, or in the example you gave, causality is just a term among many terms that organize our experience, in a certain way, that is a causal argument. Because what's at issue is the primacy of this concept of causality. In the act of communicating the idea, you are trying to affect a change at the level of thought and at the level of the organization of terms. So obviously, if you're someone who takes the view that causality is one term among many and it simply organizes our experience, and you first undertake to think that, to develop those thoughts, and then to communicate them and so on, you're really preoccupied with concepts. Now, the real problem is what else is there besides thinking? And that seems to me to be the real heart of the matter when you're talking about the disruptions of contact. Because human beings, because this, again, for lack of a better term, consciousness, only seems to manifest here and there. For us, at the level of reflection, when we reflect and so on, all we have is thought. And so the limits of thought are always already conceptualized. They're always already arrived at by thought, in terms of thought. And sure, you can come up with all sorts of clever and important and valid paradoxes and ways to describe it, formalisms and so on. But if at the level of, again, for lack of a better term, let's say concrete experience, you had a bunch of, alien blondes showing up in human life all the time and drawing human experience of consciousness out, it's a kind of refutation of causality that it's not the same as a refutation of the concept of causality. It might effectively be that, but what happens is something totally different. To go back to the analogy of like the tribe or the clan in the woods who they've never realized they can run, you could have over the course of centuries all sorts of members of that tribe stand up and say, well, listen, all this talk of running is bullshit. I'm going to demonstrate. And he tries to run. He can't do it. Falls down. He gets up. He tries again. He walks quickly, maybe. Maybe he stands on one leg. He jumps up and down. He shifts from one leg to another in rapid succession while he's standing in place. He has demonstrated, quote unquote, that running doesn't exist. It's impossible. But the day somebody shows up who is running right in front of them, and then spontaneously people within that little hypothetical fanciful group see it, are able to mimic it, some of them have the capacity, and then start to run, that it's a kind of undeniable fundamental change at the level of experience that, of course, later on, perhaps, will be reflected in thought, in culture, and that sort of thing. But it's not something that can be arrived at through thought in advance. So these acts of knowing, events, even when we talk about events being separate, that's a nice assumption. The example you used, the theory that, it's a one electron universe or whatever, you can go in parallel and you can say, well, it's a one event universe. On what basis do we say that two events are different? I mean, how can we even call them two events? Again, this is not necessarily, I'm not necessarily pleading for a different concept of causality, which certainly people do, but something more concrete that if it actually takes place, it blots out everything else. And of course, for human populations, there would be disruption. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's hard to say. It could be both. But maybe it's to some people or to some otherworldly beings is not necessarily desirable. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, where this brings me back to is what we were talking about recently, where I had been saying that I think that Parmenides and Heraclitus are both right, and that their perspectives are actually complementary. In exactly the same way that a compatibilist would argue that free will and determinism are both complementary. In a scientific context, this gets talked about as the difference between presentism and eternalism. The idea that only the present moment is real versus the idea that everything that ever has happened, is happening, and will happening are real, and they all simultaneously coexist. Sometimes people call that block world. I think that what you're saying really boils down to something along the lines of us being viscerally plugged in to the idea of block world. Because if these experiences of knowing are occurring, okay, so I'm looking up at the flying saucer over the hill, and I know that it sees me and it moves in concert with my perception in such a way that suggests, and I know, in fact, that it's playing games with me. Or, people have an intuition, they have a vision, someone's dead, and in fact they are dead. If there's not a causal explanation for that, i.e., information travels through space, and then, it triggers something, which is in process. If, however, it's more non-local, and I think really quantum mechanics, people try to say it's mechanistic and it's physicalist, but really we're going so far outside the domain for which, from a sort of Kantian transcendental point of view, our machinery is meant to operate. That quantum mechanics is already calling this stuff into question, and it's much more mysterious than people in philosophy of science and a lot of working physicists might assume. So anyway, if it's operating in the way that you're suggesting, then it's going to kind of viscerally tilt people's perception toward block world. And if you're looking at things under the aspect of eternity, then that tends to privilege different cultural norms and values too, because you could say that the humanist project of liberal progressivism puts a certain emphasis on cause as opposed to, say, destiny, that cultures that tend to presuppose the sort of eternal, harmonious coexistence of all things tend to privilege, right? So this visceral connection to these weird atemporal, acausal events could start to tilt values away from value systems that thrive on and privilege the existence of causality into value systems that don't have as much to do with productive activity in the material world.
Well, it's difficult to paint a full picture of, I guess, what I'm trying to get at, because maybe, sort of the best I can come up with are these strange sounding analogies. But you mentioned, for example, seeing things in terms of time or seeing things in terms of eternity. It seems to me that both of those perspectives are developed and occur at the level of thought. And that's precisely why we have the disjunction between them. These antinomies in general, for example, between the one and the many. I'm not talking about something like a contradiction, like one, or let's say being and nothingness, but one and the many. This is an antinomy, it seems to me. It's not a contradiction. It's not an identity. They exist in a strange relation. Neither is absolutely primary because one can always be flipped into the other. And while we're talking about it in a sort of detailed way, my position at this point is that all of these antinomies of human thought, which are inevitable because we're using thought, I think these are inherited from spatial perception. And I think that they all come down to something called handedness, the difference between left and right. I also happen to think personally that handedness is built into three-dimensional space, and that our reason, our thinking, and certainly all of our formalisms duplicate, maybe for anatomical reasons, physiological reasons, maybe the way the brain developed, the representational parts of the brain, or the parts of the brain that are now used for that, developed out of spatial orientation, moving the body around, so on and so forth. But who's to say? But all of this and the reflections and the attempts to accommodate eternity, which might be considered the one, with, let's say, time, which is understood to be sequential, a succession of moments or events, so on, which could be considered the many. These are paradoxes that arise at the level of thought, and they have to do with some sort of basic incompatibility that generates thinking, that is practically the engine of thinking, and maybe that ultimately will be something like handedness. But when you're talking about the knowing, these events of knowing that seem to take place, you're no longer within the realm of thought. I mean, if you can imagine somebody who, let's say, has been blind from birth, and then at, age 16 or 19 or whatever, the doctor in medical science, they're able to go in there and flip a switch, and all of a sudden now they have full vision. There was no way to arrive at vision for that person at the level of thought. Whatever all of the talk and the concepts, maybe somebody's a trained physicist and they understand while blind, maybe he's like a prodigy or something. Or let's move it up to like age 40, whatever. You could have somebody who is like an optical physicist who understands all of the formal technical descriptions for how human vision is possible, who's been blind, and then at age 40, you flip the switch and now they can see. Well, that seeing is irreducible. And the ongoing effects of that seeing after it's turned on are also irreducible. You're adding a whole new sense. And that sense, and certainly all of the experiences that follow, that have been shaped by, have been constituted by the addition of that sense, they were never accessible at the level of thought. So, by analogy, if, of course, the popular term for some psychic knowing is the sixth sense. If you've got beings showing up who routinely are engaged in this kind of knowing with each other. And then because it's not some phenomenon that's strictly limited to them, human beings are exposed to it through contact with them on a more routine basis, following some contact scenario. And then human beings begin to develop this sense automatically just through exposure to it, exposure to them, in the same way that seeing some people run triggers this running in the people who never thought it possible and never ran before. You're going to have changes that exceed thought and occur well outside of it, in a way are more fundamental than thinking. And sure, that wouldn't instantaneously mean that thought ends. But you have to wonder what philosophy and thinking and all of these things are like for these beings, to the extent that any of the accounts and descriptions we have of them are in any way accurate. I mean, there's an experience that you yourself described where I won't try to recount it in detail because I can't, and it's your experience and you know better, but getting some sort of communication where in the reaction that you were given to things like economics and philosophy and so on was that it was unnecessarily complicated. That was all sort of like ornate, needlessly developed, arbitrary distinctions, so on and so forth. Well, the idea that if human beings in the human population start to develop in the direction of this type of knowing as a kind of sense, the idea that thought would continue in the way that it has, or would be as much needed, isn't necessarily the case. You can imagine that that thing that we've taken for granted for so long might actually start to atrophy. The whole focus of it could become much narrower. The application of it could be much more narrow, and maybe questions of causality go out the window. I mean, there's a story, I don't know who tells it now, I can't remember, but there was one of the anecdotes of the Greys, or what, where supposedly they couldn't understand why human beings have clocks, or they couldn't understand why our whole idea of measuring time or keeping track of time, because they simply didn't have it. Now, is that because in some they're cognitively more primitive, they're not able to understand it? No. Presumably, the story always goes, the speculation always goes, oh, they're more advanced than us. What if they no longer have any need for it? Because the overall shape of their experience is different, and the direction of the experience is different. If something like that is any indicator, then all of our complex attempts to grapple with concepts like causality, they might fall by the wayside as well. Those attempts might just dry up, and after a sufficient interval, people will simply forget what it was like to have the need to try to grapple with those questions, because now the experience is different.
Yeah. I think that a lot of aspects of our language, our culture, and what you might call our habitual cognitive strategies are efforts to compensate for or circumvent aspects of reality that are not accessible to us or amenable to manipulation by our powers. So on the cultural front, if you look at Egypt, a lot of the culture seems to be oriented toward circumventing or surmounting one thing that we don't have cognitive or sensory experiential access to, which is the reality of death. And that's the case, you could argue, in all culture, but it's kind of very explicit in the Egyptian case, and it's, I think, useful to think about because it's an early case, and it acted kind of as an archetype for how other cultural forms could be organized. And so much of what you see in the art and in the buildings and the purposes of everything is an attempt to compensate for death. And my point here is that death is one of many unknowns that we are confronted by perpetually. Another unknown is what's going on in the subjective experience of the other cognitive agents that you're interacting with. You don't know what the person in your hunting party is thinking. You don't know what your mate is thinking. You don't know what the people over there who live in the other valley are thinking. So that's another unknown for which language and culture evolved to compensate. And so on for trying to estimate what's going to happen in the future, because we don't have direct experiential access to the future. Everything that we do in language and culture is largely predicated on the effort to deal with what you can't see, what you can't hear, what you can't know. So here's the thing. What we can see and hear and know is contingent on the inheritance of our evolutionary biology. We happen to have these senses. We can see, we can hear, and so on, because the weird combination of structures that evolved here found it useful to keep track of that sort of information and render it in the sense that information gets rendered in a video game in a certain way. Colors don't have to be rendered like colors. People who have synesthesia experience them as what we would ordinarily think of as sound, and vice versa. Any of what's going on in the noumenon out there in the world could be rendered in radically different ways, and there's other information that we ignore that other animals can sense, like the Earth's geomagnetic field. Birds apparently have a sense that renders that presumably in some qualitative way that's accessible to their conscious minds. I think it's critical to bear in mind, too, that like less than 1% of all the functions that are carried out by the brain are accessible to consciousness. It seems like consciousness is kind of a strategy to deal with the sort of things that aren't sufficiently rote as to be automated. But these beings, they might render reality in a totally different way, which gives them access to the ability to manipulate realities in a different way, i.e. communication, and to know things in a different way, i.e. what's going to happen tomorrow. Because if somehow spatial relationships, temporal relationships look more like spatial relationships to them, then they're not going to be challenged by the same unknowns that we are, i.e. what's going to happen tomorrow. If they're telepathic, it's not an unknown what some other person that they're interacting with is thinking. And so their whole strategy for existing in the world is going to be totally different. And if this is that fundamental, if thought and language are based on we're operating within a certain range of limitations, and you take those limitations away, then you're sliding a table out under a really complicated card castle that is culture.
Well, I agree with that, and that would be why any kind of contact could be disruptive for reasons that aren't usually discussed. You know, it's not necessarily the parallel of the primitive tribe being exposed to more advanced technology and being robbed of their own spontaneity or being overcome with, an attempt to imitate. It couldn't, it could be that it's not any of the scenarios that have already been posited, but, it's useful to talk about the gap that we're supposing between us and them in terms of senses. You can see the utility of it when compared to questions of knowledge. What I mean is at the level of knowledge, there are known unknowns. So at the level of knowledge, we can verbalize, we can articulate that there might be a dramatic difference in the experience of a creature, a being, when they have more highly developed senses than we do. Certain animals are said to be able to see into the UV spectrum, I think. The example you gave of birds being able to sense electromagnetic fields, let's suppose that's a bona fide sense in the same way that sight and touch and so on are. At the level of thought, we can articulate this point of view, but actually knowing or coming up with what another sense might be, we don't. You can't imagine it. You can know that perhaps we can't imagine it. We can think in those terms at the level of thought, but having an added sense, something we can't even conceptualize, added to you in your experience, again, it's an irreducible thing. It cannot be achieved through thought. Now, there may well be cases that out there in the wide universe, there are creatures with senses that we cannot conceptualize, we can't even imagine. But in the specific cases that we've been discussing, particularly this phenomenon of knowing, I think that's sort of a middle case in a sense, where this occurs here and there in the human population, but at the same time, it's something that we cannot conceptualize because, in a way, because of its proximity to thought rather than its separateness or its distance from thought. To use the term knowing to describe this, obviously there's some sort of close relationship between thinking and knowing, even in everyday speech. If you're able to think something, you're able to know something, broadly speaking, or if you're able to know something, you can think about it. Yet at the same time, when you hear these accounts, the type of knowing that's involved, while not being mystical, not being transcendental, nevertheless are arrived at not through thought. So what it comes down to is, a possibility that it could become more prevalent among individual human beings as a kind of sense. And the more prevalent it becomes, not only in terms of numbers of individuals, but the greater and greater share of day-to-day experience is shaped by that kind of knowing, it will lead to dramatically different results in terms of, the types of human beings that appear.
Sure, absolutely. I think we think of thought as being the natural default activity of the human organism in a rest state. And to a large extent, that's the case. But I think that there are certain phenomena that we identify with thinking that are, I guess you could say, strong, culturally contingent. And they have been for a long time. But, our species has only existed for so long. And language has existed for a shorter period than that. if we were perceiving in fundamentally different ways, then certain classes of linguistic activity would become unnecessary, or they would be radically reshaped. If I think that this would be at once very like in your face, and could also be something that's very subtle that takes place over a long course of time. It also remains to be seen how many people are capable of this sense of knowing that you're talking about, or telepathy, or let's say manipulating objects with their mind. That's another thing that the Greys are sometimes purported as being able to do. It could be that that's 0.001% of the population. It could be that's 50% of the population. So the patterns of bleed through could be anywhere along a spectrum of how disruptive it is, how immediate the effects are, what it does to the sciences, what it does to the arts, and so on.
Well, there could be major disruptions along these lines when you talk about what we regard in everyday language as consciousness, identifying just one part of the overall phenomenon, as people do. They talk about partial aspects. It's been the position of psychoanalysis since its origins that the ego is not the master of its own house. So when you read Freud and the way he frames the discovery, quote unquote, of the unconscious, or if you read Lacan, and Lacan talks about the Copernican revolution that Freud represents, you do have some precedent for supposing that this default state, as you call it, of thinking is not actually the end-all and be-all. It's very possible to conceive of consciousness in the ordinary sense, self-consciousness, being aware of what one's doing, as a way to address a social limitation. If we're going to talk about it in terms of limitations, because, of course, being able to account for yourself, being able to say what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're thinking even, can all be regarded as being ultimately addressed to some outside. In this sense, introspection, even philosophical reflection, is not only not the primary thing, but it's a sort of dodge. It's an extraneous feature, because the more fundamental fact is a social orientation to the outside. From the earliest days of the human creature in early childhood, the argument goes, you enter into a world of language, and when you enter into the world of language, you're basically giving up your pound of flesh in order to communicate on terms that you did not create, you had no hand in developing. You're giving yourself over to something that exists before you and that nobody ultimately has control over. There's nobody in charge of the English language, for example. Even though the people who make the Oxford English Dictionary might like to think that they are, there's nobody who's stipulating what English is, and yet everyone is using it all the time. When it comes down to our thoughts, even our innermost thoughts about ourselves and what we're thinking and what we're feeling and why we do the things we do, all of this can be viewed as already being addressed to an outside. The fact that we can even think it at all, the fact we can even formulate it, could be read as like potential preparation for some either particular instance or maybe just an overall general state of preparedness for accounting for oneself. Now, you could take it a step further and then say the whole experience of the individual, the phenomenological experience of the individual, everything that you think you're experiencing, everything that you're experiencing even without being aware that you're thinking about it. To the extent that it's already socialized, it's already something that is addressed to the limitation. The fact that we don't automatically know effortlessly what everyone around us is thinking. The fact that we even still put it in terms of what they are thinking is another instance of the same application of assumptions. The they, the thinking in terms of thoughts, as if thoughts are quanta, they're discrete units somehow that exist. Just like other people are discrete units. Well, if you have this added layer of knowing, those distinctions could erode and maybe ultimately go out the window. And this could account for various descriptions and accounts people come up with of these otherworldly beings not having the same individuality. They're all uniform. They all seem to be the same. And then, of course, you've got limited human beings patting themselves on the back saying, oh, well, however powerful they are, at least we're individuals, and that'll be our strength, which could be complete rubbish, could be total bullshit.
It may or it may not. I mean, it could be that if you link people together, that you lose the benefit of some of the dialectical interplay that you can get from opposing viewpoints. Or it may not be. It could be that once we're talking at the species level, better or worse is starting to become irrelevant. In the same way that it might be irrelevant to compare the rhinoceros to a South American tree frog, right? Which one of those is better? Well, they have capacities that sort of evolved to serve different purposes. So it all depends on what your measuring stick is. Now, if the Greys became interstellar in virtue, or they were able to travel back in time or traverse some dimensional boundary or whatever, in virtue of the style of individual / collective cognitive coexistence that they appear to manifest, well, then that might be a point in favor of it being better in some way. But in as much as something like measuring time with a clock doesn't make sense to them, other things that have pragmatic utility might not make sense to them. And perhaps some things that we think of as being morally or aesthetically desirable also wouldn't make sense to them. The thing is that every individual, and to more of an extent, every type of creature, inhabits a different universe from a phenomenological point of view, although that's more dictated by biological capacities. From a ethical, linguistic, cultural point of view, the internal representation of the world that you have, the sense that you have of what is possible and impossible. Different types of creatures inhabit different universes, and perhaps we inhabit a universe that's more similar to a rhinoceros or a penguin because we share a phylogenetic inheritance. We're part of the same family of life that emerged on this planet. But if we're interacting with things that are from other planets, or other dimensions or whatever, their way of being might overlap with ours much more partially than a rhinoceros does. And here's another possibility. People presume that they're superior and not different, just different. And at first, at least, people aren't going to be making a distinction between the senses in which they're superior and the senses in which they're just different. Well, some people might. But we might regard every way that they are different as a way in which they're superior because we are so overawed by them, and then acclimatize ourselves to that way of being. Or if it's something we can't do, some sense that we could never manifest, we might just ape it, parrot it, act as if we've acquired this new sense, and sort of represent reality to ourselves as if we have it and we don't. A lot of weird things like that could go on.
Well, at a cultural level, that is surely the case. And you see it now. You see a lot of what amounts to romanticizing of, let's say, these events of knowing, talking about in terms of telepathy and so on, or coming up with causal models, or thinking about everyone being one as a kind of moral or spiritual goal. But that is also my point, that there is no comparison. If you had the human species in a hypothetical world, just as they are now, but let's say with no sight, and then all of a sudden one day by magic somebody flipped a switch and the whole human population was able to see, pretty quickly they would begin to forget what it was ever like not to see. And all of the talk about what's lost, maybe all of the wonderful things that deaf people are able to do blind people are able to do to compensate, in a global population where that is civilization, maybe, the better part of it would disappear. To talk about that in terms of loss and so on is also a distortion, I think, that is created at the level of thought. Because once that switch is thrown and everyone sees, experience as such now is different. And I agree, if any of the accounts are to be believed, there's no reason to think or to decide that a given difference means a superiority. Yet nevertheless, we constantly are given that interpretation. And it has to do with a lot of the psychological and religious and cultural things that go on even today in people. The aspirational context that frames all of the discussions of contact among the few people who have those discussions. Because, of course, human beings want a better world, they want a better life, they want better, better, better. But I agree also that there's in a way no comparison, because comparison is only achievable at the level of thought. And if at the innermost level of experience itself changes, then what you thought or what you want to think in a way no longer matters. And it will be the tail that's wagged by the dog.
Yeah. I think when stuff like this happens, when we think about the likely effects of contact, it brings us up into some of the very same things that define philosophy. Because in a sense, I think philosophy is defined by uh, how we butt up against the unknown and the unknowable. What's the ultimate nature of reality? How do you know anything? What is the purpose and destiny of the human species? Anything like that. It's all fundamentally defined by what we don't know and what it's not easy for us to know. Uh, we tend to, I think that with the sort of cartoonish new age spectrum of interest in the UFO phenomena and the close encounter phenomena and abduction, there's a presumption that because they can see things we can't, that they can see everything. This is dramatized to a large extent in the Dune novels. I started reading through the whole series recently, and I took a break somewhere in the middle. But in the first three books, they talk about the protagonist as he can see the future, he knows what's going to happen, but that's also very limiting because uh, it's what you now call a second order chaotic system. A first order system, or a second order complex system, maybe. A first order system isn't changed by what you know about it. A second order system is changed by what you know about it. Like, let's say, the economy. If everybody knows that a stock is going to crash tomorrow, that'll change their behavior, which in turn will change the outcome. And the thing about seeing the future in, in Dune, which they really draw out and very dramatically, and it's central to the plot, and it's very interesting, the philosophical ramifications of this, is the protagonist can see more than other people, but not everything. And he tries to explain it to someone saying, look, you're standing at the base of this dune, I'm standing on the top of it, but there are taller dunes in the distance that I can't see over. Uh, and I think that sort of relativizing, that limiting of powers that we think of as usually being all encompassing, it is critical to being able to think effectively about these other beings.
Well, Dune is an excellent series of books. It's among my favorites, if not the favorite series of novels in its category that I've read. You won't find anything better in so-called science fiction. As far as it goes, it's possible to imagine different things. If you have a population of beings that are on a routine basis caught up in this type of knowing, and the knowing is not necessarily a knowing about events, quote unquote, discrete, arbitrarily circumscribed areas of time, supposed to be in the future, but maybe not. But it's a process that takes place among them, with each other. It would still permit, it seems to me, for that type of the more what we would normally call precognition in a particular way, and that is, I mean, you can see something like precognition in an individual human being. You can see it perhaps taking place in as much as the complex systems that are being seen, a given state of the complex system that is the world. That individual is also not only in that complex state, but is comprised of the very same complexity. I don't mean complexity in terms of the same quantity of complexity, but I'm saying is basically part and parcel of the same complex system, and therefore, perhaps, here and there, for reasons we cannot conceive, a conscious, quote unquote, person is able to suddenly possess information, again, quote unquote, about some arbitrarily considered separate system or state of affairs. Now, if you have a population on some distant world that they all, in a way, inhabit the same mental space, to the extent you want to define same, but let's say considerably more same with each other than between humans, the same, possible explanation, the same possible results could apply, and maybe even in a more pronounced way. It could be that extraterrestrials are able to see the future here and there and to know the future simply as an indirect consequence of all being wired up with one another. Because now, instead of having one individual who, again, for reasons we can leave aside, but for the ultimate reason that they are one and the same at the level of substance, let's say, as this other state of affairs that they suddenly have knowledge about, instead of just having one individual where that can occur, you have a population all inhabiting the same mental space. You have all these different instances of participation in, to co-opt a philosophical term, substance, let's say. And therefore, maybe they have a broader capacity. Maybe more often they're able to know things, and they're able to know things in more detail than we do. But that would be a different way of accounting for it without necessarily involving, going a little bit further out instead of just saying there are events, and there are events that are closer, let's say in the future or whatever, and there are events that are farther in the future, and the closer ones are more visible, the farther ones are not, or there are obstacles to seeing certain events, quote unquote. It could be that the locus of consciousness in a population that's all, telepathically linked, for lack of a better term, automatically produces what we regard as precognition more often and with greater clarity.
Sure. And I mean, this sort of knowledge could come about by any number of means. It could come about by a genetic mutation. It could come about by, it could have come about initially by something in culture, like, let's say, a school for the development of certain faculties, chemical alteration, nanotechnology. Each one of those things would imply something different about the nature and the extent of such an ability. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the most fundamental things that defines any attempt to respond to the UFO phenomena and other similar mysteries philosophically is the notion of underdetermination, namely situations wherein, in science, where you have more than one possible explanation consistent with the same data set. The data set doesn't dictate which among several options of theoretical frameworks you need to adopt. For example, these guys could be from some kind of post-singularity, technological singularity civilization, where they've developed a strong general artificial intelligence, and they can upload their minds into a virtual world. And some people have suggested that if that's possible, it might account for some of the Fermi paradox, because once you can upload your mind into a perfect virtual world where you can pursue whatever you perceive as being desirable, whether that's straight up hedonism or the contemplation of the universe or whatever else, maybe a lot of civilizations do that and they disappear into virtual space. Okay, so, well, what if we're dealing with something like that. And the reason for the self-similarity of the grays is because these are just sort of robotic, or maybe cyborg avatars of a species that now inhabits virtual space. I mean, that's just one among many, many scenarios we could dream up. Uh, but when we're dealing with beings that have a different co- a biological constitution, they're from somewhere else in the universe. I mean, we don't know what the hell is going on. They could be much further beyond us, very close to us, as we said earlier in the discussion. And all that gives us a radically different set of possibilities. For most of this conversation, we've been entertaining or at least I think mainly we've been constraining ourselves to thinking about it in the way that you framed earlier, having to do with their biological similarity and some kind of groundedness in that. But it's also important to bear in mind that really the sky's the limit, and any kind of weird thing could be the case that grants them these abilities.
You can counter, interestingly, the idea of underdetermination with a concept from, structuralism and post-structuralism called overdetermination, which is that, in a structural system of language, any particular signifier is overdetermined. That is, it's basically defined by all of its individual relations to other signifiers. So for any given place in a symbolic system, any given signifier taken in isolation, you have an astronomical number of relations that not only determine it, but overdetermine it. And then at the level of thought, if you want to proceed by analogy, thought is overdetermined. We're always, to the extent we engage in thinking, our thought takes place within a system of thoughts, past thoughts, wherever you want to arbitrarily put your focus. But the sum total of the past thinking of the individual, the inherited thinking of the culture, the whole shebang. And so at the level of thought, even the unknowns are overdetermined by the sum total of the knowledge that we have and the relationships between facts and speculations and our relationships to those same. But and I guess my point in saying that is to try to, again, raise up this theme, because my point has not been that there is a specific scenario that, if it were the case, would give rise to events of knowing in a given alien population. But rather to say that if you put your focus on these events of knowing, it looks like an outside to thought. And then you can begin to speculate, if you like, as you've just done, and as I did a minute ago, and even earlier, about what could cause that to arise. What could account for these things in the broadest sort of way, and be consistent with the so-called evidence, such as it is, that comes to us in the form of these accounts and so on. I mean, it's very interesting to start to consider, because in identifying a possible outside to thought, to the extent that anything can be outside thought for us, it opens up interesting new ways to think, new things to think about. It's possible to imagine that there is a sort of natural course that intelligent populations take with some regularity throughout the universe. talking about humanoids, sufficiently similar to human beings, etc., where once they start to acquire knowledge of their fundamental makeup, their genetics, and so on, they inevitably start to take steps to breed out of the population bad mutations, genes and traits that, for whatever reason, aren't desired. And as they proceed down this path, an inevitable consequence is something like more uniformity between individuals in the population. So a species, an intelligent species, will start to move toward a sort of narrower point with less individual variation. Add to that a scenario in which they start to develop the means of interstellar space travel. And the physical problems that an organism faces when it evolves on a planet, but then wants to start traveling among the stars. Well, maybe they then start to genetically alter themselves physically in order to deal with the abnormal environment of space and space travel. So they augment themselves. They start to change themselves so that they require less food, less nutrition, maybe just for general survival purposes or for optimizing survival. They not only breed, but genetically manipulate themselves to have increased intelligence. And, all of these different reasons for changing themselves could all occur. They could all overlap and converge. And then maybe as sort of an accident, what we call telepathy becomes more and more apparent among them because of their manipulations, maybe particular manipulations and manipulations in general toward a uniform, exemplar member of the species. Maybe this is the reason why they become linked up to each other in ways that we can barely fathom at this point. And then maybe they discover that that's the case, and then they try to maximize that. So then they start to breed and alter themselves in that direction. So I agree with you, the sky's the limit. There's no particular scenario. It makes for great science fiction.